Welcome to The Real News. I'm Kim Brown in Baltimore. During the past week, protests took place throughout Mexico in reaction to a 20% price increase for gasoline. The protests have so far resulted in 4 deaths and the arrest of over 700 people. Also, over 300 stores are said to have been looted throughout the country. The gasoline price increase is part of a plan by President Enrique Pina Nieto to eliminate subsidies in the wake of the partial privatization of the country's oil industry. On Wednesday, President Pina Nieto vowed to continue with the price increases despite the protests. Well, joining us today from Mexico City to analyze the situation in Mexico, we're joined with John Ackerman. John is a professor at the National Autonomous University of Mexico. He's also editor-in-chief of the Mexican Law Review and a columnist with both La Jornada newspaper and Proceso magazine. John, thank you so much for being here.
Pleasure as always to be on the Real Network.
Appreciate it, John. So, John, give us some background about these protests because people are said to be reacting to the price increase of gasoline. So is that all, or is there more to this?
No, this is not just about gas or gas prices. This is another step in the collapse of the legitimacy of the ruling government, the ruling regime. We can compare it, I think, to the government of Carlos Andrés Pérez in Venezuela. About 25 years ago, beginning of the 90s, Carlos Andrés Pérez came back for his second presidency, and one of his most important reforms was privatizing, more privatizing. They already had oil more privatized than it was in Mexico, but deepening the privatization of oil in Venezuela. This led to a fiscal crisis of the state and led to widespread protest and the collapse of what used to be considered the most stable, centralist democracy in Latin America, in Venezuela. And we had a revolution, a peaceful revolution, which led to a new constitution, led to a new government. And this is the process we're in the middle of. In Mexico, I'm not trying to say that, we're going to have a Chavez coming in or Maduro, or that Mexico is going to follow the path of Venezuela for good or for bad, or however you want to look at it. But Mexico is going through a collapse of its sitting government, and this is being expressed through the question of oil. When Enrique Pina Nieto came in 2012, one of his most important policy programs was to privatize oil. As a result of this oil privatization, he promised that oil prices would come down and that Mexico would grow through increased international investment. Well, this increase of 20% increase from one day to the next on New Year's Day of 2017 has finally convinced the Mexican people, demonstrating this was all just a lie from the very beginning. He did privatize the oil, but this was not for the benefit of Mexicans, but for the benefits of his friends and the big oil companies. And so this is finally sinking in with the Mexican people, and that's what we're seeing with these protests explicitly against the gas hike, but more generally against authoritarianism and repression in Mexico.
Well, John, then it begs the question, do you think that the situation could endanger the president's position? Because according to polls, his popularity was already at a historic low.
Yes, Enrique Pina Nieto is the most despised, I would say, president we've had in Mexico in recent history. Not even, Carlos Salinas or Vicente Fox or Felipe Calderón, who also got very low in their public opinion ratings, did not get as low as Enrique Pina Nieto. Mexico had been, until Pina Nieto, an exception in Latin America. The Mexican people, although they saw there were serious problems with neoliberalism, repression, authoritarianism, in the end they kind of hoped or believed that the president was going to save them, that he was on their side of the people. But with Enrique Pina Nieto, this has changed. Now Pina Nieto has approval ratings down in 10, 15, 20% is the highest number I've seen in recent polls. And he gave a state of a national address on all the television channels yesterday at night, and he looked pretty tired. You could note it in his face. You could note it in his expression. He himself seems to kind of want to unpack his bags. He's still got another 2 years left, which could be too long for him. One of the good opportunities is that we do have elections coming up next year in 2018, federal presidential elections, also for the National Congress, lots of state governments. And so that could be an opportunity for reviving politics and democracy in Mexico.
So what is the situation like in Mexico at the moment? I mean, does it look like the protests will expand further, or are they decreasing?
Okay, well, let's see what's happening in Mexico today. There are really two separate types of protests or actions going on. On one hand, we have peaceful protests against the gas hikes and broader against Peña Nieto and against neoliberalism. People are taking highways. They're peaceful, but they are strong protests of closing off important highways, giving free passage through toll roads, closing off, cordoning off gas stations, which have now been privatized, which are no longer, many of them of Pemex, the national company, but are now run by private corporations. And so that's been happening pretty much peacefully, and it's been growing. Particularly, of course, taxi drivers, public transportation drivers have been the ones who've been most active in this because they're the ones who are going to be hurt the most. It's going to be hard for them to raise the prices for the people who are using public transport or taxing, but they're going to have to eat up that 20% increase directly in their income. On the other hand, there have been some violent actions. I would not call them protest actions. In fact, the information which I have, and many journalists have been looking into this, can see, is that most, if not all, of riots which have been leading to theft are provoked by the government itself. There are plenty of videos, for instance, we can see in which the police itself has been protecting these protesters, supposed protesters. There are lots of reports of youth being hired by the police, being paid 800 pesos, 1,000 pesos in order to do rioting. It looks like a concerted strategy by the regime itself to try to discredit the peaceful protests against the gas hike. So we need to be very clear about these two different manifestations. There's no evidence that any of the peaceful protests have then gone to, take over or steal goods from these big supermarkets. These are two independent phenomena, one being produced by the government itself, provocateurs, classic strategies of the Mexican government. On the other hand, authentically angered citizens who are protesting against the gas hike.
John, I know you said that these protests are not solely because of the 20% increase in the price of gasoline, though that seems to have been the catalyst. But it's kind of ironic that Mexico, the government decided to enact these price hikes shortly after opening up some deep water tracts for deep oil exploration for the purpose of getting more gas and oil out of Mexican waters. I mean, these things seem to be relatively close together on the calendar, are they not?
Right, exactly. I mean, this is this is why people are so angry, because Peña Nieto has been promising all along that the privatization of oil was going to lead to the reduction of prices. The problem is that this is just not the case, and as many of us knew from the very beginning, if you privatize the oil, you're going to get a fiscal crisis, and the government is now desperate to get money from any source possible, and it's one of the easiest ways are these consumption taxes on oil, and so they are trying to bring it in order to avoid a complete collapse of the government. But by doing so, they're angering even more the people. So it's a vicious cycle, which is really starting to bring this government down. These new contracts for deep oil are private contracts in which there's a big question about what percentage is actually going to get into the Mexican government's coffers and be able to be used for social services, for instance, because of the low price of oil. Mexico has been forced to sweeten these deals and turn them into real gifts for the international oil corporations. And so Mexico is getting less and less income out of oil, and the needs for hospitals and schools are today just as important as ever been before. So we're getting this kind of crisis. That's why I compare this from the top to the situation in Venezuela in the 90s, or in Bolivia in the beginning of the 21st century. There were protests over access to water, for instance, which of course were not just about water, but it was about, in general, the privatization of public services. Mexico, up till now, had been sort of an exception to this social protest and this political move towards the left. We've been lost in neoliberalism forever, seemingly, but perhaps Mexico might finally be getting onto this left-wing wave ironically, precisely at the moment in which the South American countries are shifting back to the right.
Well, you have to explain to us like how other political sectors are reacting to the protests, particularly what is the reaction from the leader of the country's left, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, and his new political party, Morena. So in a recent article for the publication NACLA, you suggested that Morena is enjoying a great boost in popularity already before these protests and lootings began. So how are these developments affecting him and his party?
Yes, López Obrador achieved in 2016 what neither Bernie Sanders nor Pablo Iglesias from Podemos in Spain achieved in 2016. Both Podemos and Bernie Sanders did a great job, but in the end, Bernie Sanders, was campaigning for Hillary Clinton, and Podemos, in its second round in the parliamentary elections in Spain, actually reduced its voting, and the new president is the same old president, the right wing in Spain. While in 2016, what Morena and López Obrador achieved is to really this overreach and get to go. I'm confusing Spanish English here. Sorry about this, but commit the so desired sorpaso, which is when the new left really just sort of goes by. The old left leaves the PRD, which is our old left, it's our Democratic Party, it's the Socialist Party of France, has really been left on the wayside, and Morena has really positioned itself as really the number one contender for the 2018 elections. Now, with these oil protests, López Obrador has been supporting the protests, of course, has been the peaceful protests, and has called publicly for the Congress, a special session of Congress, to revoke the increase in the gas prices. Pena Nieto responded to that yesterday saying, no, we're going straight ahead. We're not going to change things. And so this is a rebuke to López Obrador, but in the end demonstrates that López Obrador is the only one who really defends the budget of the people. And I think in the end, this is going to strengthen López Obrador. One of the reasons why they've been using all these provocateurs to create scenes of violence is precisely to try to blame Morena and López Obrador for the violence and trying to use this to reduce his prestige. But he's playing it, I think, quite well, quite institutionally, calling for peaceful protests and calling for the political organization of the Mexican people so as to change the federal government in 2018.
Indeed. Well, John, we certainly appreciate you giving us your expertise and updating us on the situation in Mexico. We hope to check in with you soon to find out how these developments are continuing to progress.
Thank you so much, Kim. Pleasure as always.
All right. We've been joined with John Ackerman. He is a professor at the National Autonomous University of Mexico. He's also editor-in-chief of the Mexican Law Review, and you can check out his columns in both La Jornada newspaper and the Proceso magazine. John, we appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching the Real News Network.